My name is David Sandalo. I'm the inaugural fellow here at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University and co-director of the Energy and Environment Concentration at the School of International Public Affairs. Delighted to welcome you here this morning to talk about renewable energy. We have a great guest. I'll introduce him in a minute, but first, just a few program notes. Like all of our events, this event is being broadcast live for those of you who are watching online. You can participate in our question and answer session after our speaker's remarks. Just send your questions by Twitter, hashtag CGEP events. That's Center on Global Energy Policy Events, hashtag CGEP events, to join the dialogue after our speaker's remarks. And please, everyone, follow us on Twitter at Columbia U Energy. This is one of a series of events that we are doing this fall on energy topics. Let me just tell you about a few of the ones that are coming up. Next Wednesday, we have a session on a topic in the news today, the Iran deal, called Decertifying the Iran Deal, 9:30 a.m. At the International Affairs Building, room 1512, with a great collection of experts on that topic. On Monday, October 30, we are welcoming to Columbia Chairman Liu Zhenya, former chairman of China State Grid, the world's largest utility, who will talk about clean energy and global energy interconnection. And then on Thursday, November 2nd, we have Outlook on offshore energy production in a low oil price environment at 5:30 p.m. So please join us for those events and more. Delighted to welcome back to Columbia Hamy Bahar, who works at the International Energy Agency's Renewable Energy Division as a renewable energy markets analyst. He is the lead on the IEA's Renewable Energy Market Report, which is published annually. Before working at the IEA, Hamy worked as a trade policy analyst at the OECD, where he analyzed domestic incentive measures for renewable energy sources and trade issues as well. He has deep expertise in this area. He's worked on cross-border trade and electricity. Prior to the OECD, he worked at the World Bank, holds a graduate degree from Sabanci University and a master's degree in energy resources and environment from School of Advanced International Studies, the Johns Hopkins School, SAIS. Hamy, welcome back to Columbia. Look forward to your remarks. After his remarks, we'll have a question and answer session. I'll start and then throw it open to all of you.
Thank you. It's again a pleasure to be here to basically discuss the key results of the report and basically to share with you the outcome that we have been working for a year. We publish this book annually, and next year we will publish again in October, and hopefully I'll come back here. Before I start, I would like to emphasize three important energy challenges that the world is facing. The first one is climate change, obviously. There's a Paris Agreement that is signed to keep the global warming at 2 degrees with an ambitious goal of 1.5. We have this goal. We are far away from this. This is the first challenge. The second challenge is the local air pollution, especially in Asia, and especially in developing Asia. This is a big issue for governments to deal with. The third one is energy access. About 1.2 billion people do not have electricity access at this point, mostly in developing Asia and Africa. And over my presentation, I'd like to show you how renewables can address some of those challenges and what needs to be done more. So before I start, I'd like to look at 2016 first, because there was a step change in renewable energy in 2016, which actually affected our forecast. So it's been the 6th year that this report announces record level deployment on renewables. And this year we are announcing a new one. But just before going to that, last year, not in this room, but in the other room, we announced that for the first time, renewable capacity growth, annual capacity growth, was larger than, for the first time, coal, gas, nuclear, oil combined. This was the first time that happened. It was a big story. Everyone talked about it. This year, we are moving from 50% to 2/3. So renewable capacity growth represented 2/3 of all global net capacity additions. When we look at the technologies, as you can see here in terms of installations, coal became first, followed by solar PV, wind, and gas. But one important point here, on year, solar PV capacity growth increased by 50% and reached 75 gigawatts. And for the first time, solar PV was the largest growth among all renewables. And for the first time, if you take into account coal plant retirements, solar PV was the first fuel in terms of growth in 2016. This is capacity growth, not generation. I'll come back to that later. So this is a step change. For the first time, a single renewable energy technology became the largest capacity additions globally. So this is a good story, and I'll come back to that later. This growth is mainly led by China. China, basically, domestic solar PV market increased, more than doubled in just 1 year from 15 gigawatts to 34 gigawatts. That's why China basically leads this solar PV record capacity growth. What is happening in the policies? So policy remains the main driver for renewables. So all around the world, all renewable technologies are supported by some kind of policy incentives in order to make them competitive with alternatives. But we are a little bit seeing a change in the policy environment. Over the last decade, I will say, policies were enablers for renewable energy technologies. What does this mean? This means that they were expensive. The policy incentives basically make them competitive with more cheaper fossil fuel alternatives, basically creating a demand for them in the market, otherwise which will not happen. Led by Europe, all these feed-in tariff policies. And in 2016, we estimated this year for the first time that only 20% of renewable capacity growth came from competitively set price setting mechanisms. The rest, administratively set, we call it, which means that governments set the price to buy the renewables, just simply feed-in tariffs. However, in the coming 5 years, this policy will change. So renewable policies globally will change from becoming or for being an enablers to facilitators, I will say. So in the next 5 years, our capacity growth, which I will show later on, but half of it will come from competitively price setting mechanism, which means that you open an auction for a certain capacity, developers bid, and you get the price. Why this is important? Because this makes all the supply chain to merge to the competitive prices, and which was not there before. When you exclude China into this picture, which is one of the largest markets and still on administratively set mechanisms, you actually get almost to 2/3. So which means in Latin America, in most of Middle East, Africa, in Europe, the new capacity additions will come from competitively price setting mechanism, which is an important change. And what is the result for this? So we collected about 60 gigawatt of solar PV and wind auction results that are globally. These are the results that you can see. We average them by capacity. And for the first time, solar PV auction results were lower than wind for the projects that will come online in 2019. But one important caveat here, we will watch if these projects will be realized at these prices, if they will be commissioned, because bidding is something, commissioning that project at that price is something else. So we will be watching that over time. We are keeping a database to watch these prices. But despite these caveats, the actual message remains the same. Competition is basically driving the cost down, and price discovery through competition is becoming a trend, a policy trend in the world, basically. However, when you look at the average levelized cost of energy, you are seeing that the picture is different because they are higher than auction results, because auction results still represent a minority, at least announced ones, still represent a minority of the capacity growth we have. When we calculate average global generation cost, obviously wind is still lower than solar PV. And over the forecast period, we expect average cost of solar PV to decline by a quarter, onshore wind to decline by about 13%, and offshore wind, the biggest decline is about 30 to 35%. We can come back to that about the offshore wind revolution, which is an important one to watch in the coming 5 years. Let's look at the forecast. So we are saying solar PV is entering a new era this year because of particular reason, because of few reasons that I mentioned in 2016, a step change in capacity growth, which became the first fuel. And over the coming 5 years, solar PV will represent, as you can see here, the largest capacity growth globally in the world. Not among renewables, among all fuels. So the majority of capacity additions in the coming 5 years will come from solar PV, not among renewables, but all fuels. As you can see, we are seeing a decline in hydropower because of the environmental and social concerns, and the projects are becoming more expensive, especially for large ones. And we see wind as a steady growth. Every year, we do a main case and an accelerated case. Our main case looks at the drivers and challenges of renewable growth in each country. And afterwards, we go back and we say that if those challenges are met in the coming 12 to 24 months, what happens? So this is our accelerated case, which is a big upside. This upside reflects the uncertainty in various policy uncertainties in various countries, which I will come back to that later. There are 3 major policy uncertainties that basically defines the difference between main and accelerated case. Is the grid integration challenges, policy uncertainty and regulatory uncertainty in some countries, and the lack of affordable financing, especially in developing countries. However, one important caveat here, that 82% of this growth will come just from wind and solar, which means just from variable technologies. This will have obviously implications in our power systems, which also I'll come back to that later. I'll show you how generation from those will increase over the coming 5 years. Let's look at the regional breakdown of our forecasts. The red bars that you see is the last 5 years, the renewable capacity growth in the last 5 years. China was the leader last 5 years, especially driven by hydropower, followed by European Union, United States, Japan, India, and Brazil. In the next 5 years, we will see this picture change. China remains the undisputed leader, there is no doubt, is the largest market. Despite policy uncertainties, we see United States, second largest growth market, which I'll explain later, followed by not European Union anymore, but India. For the first time in our forecast, India surpasses European Union in terms of capacity growth in the coming 5 years. This is an important step change, followed by Japan, Brazil, and Africa. Let's talk a little bit United States. Our forecast for United States remains the same, actually a little bit improved, because of basically one reason. There are policy announcements, but there are no policy changes that are driving the renewables. In the US, there are 2 drivers of renewables. One is the federal tax incentives, which were announced with a phase-out schedule 2 years ago. They are still in place. The second one is the RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standards at the state level. They are actually, over the last year, either strengthened or extended in many states. Also, a sub-driver, I will say, corporate procurement of renewables have been increasing over the last few years. But also, there are state-level policies that are supporting distributed solar PV. So these are all in place over the last year. Nothing has changed. That's why we did not change our forecasts, because our forecast looks at the actual policies and their implications on renewable growth. That's why we kept our forecast. In the EU, compared to last 5 years, there will be a 40% decline in capacity growth. There are a few reasons for this. The first one is that there is no need for demand in many countries because of the economic growth is slow, but also there's a transition in policies, which is based on auctions, which are set prices. And there's also 2030 targets in Europe, which are basically, their implementation is a little bit unknown how this will work. So in the coming few years, we will have more clarifications in European Union 2030 targets, and we will see maybe next year we will change our forecast accordingly. In India, there's an important step change. Last year, we emphasized two important challenges in India. One was the financial health of utilities. The second one is the policy uncertainty in terms of the auction implementation. And there was a sub one, which was the grid infrastructure. We see improvements over the last year in all of them. Indian government introduced a financial scheme that will help the distribution companies who are the off-takers of these, of renewables. There's also a perception change, I would say, in India. Utilities were considering renewables expensive. After the auction results, which are now in some states comparable to existing coal tariffs, they are becoming more willing to buy this power. They are actually questioning the previous renewable contracts that they signed because they were too expensive, if they will implement it or not. So we are seeing a perception change as well. And the financial health of utilities are improved significantly with this new scheme, government issuing bonds to them. We basically went state by state and looked at the financial health of utilities in each state and their renewable targets and matched them. And we saw that about 60% of the capacity growth expected in states are actually in good financial health, the distribution companies. The other 30-40% remains a challenge, obviously. And we also did an accelerated case, as you can see. Let me talk a little bit about China before going into that. So China is basically the leader of growth in every technology, no doubt. And Chinese policy is also transforming. China basically has relatively high feed-in tariffs for all technologies. Feed-in tariffs are long-term contracts. There are two important challenges in China that is basically led Chinese government to change their policies. The first one is cost of renewables, because it's becoming very expensive. And the second one is grid integration. Last year, about 17% of Chinese wind power plants generation was curtailed. Simply went to the garbage. So it's not there was possibility to produce that generation, but it was not produced because of the grid bottlenecks. And in order to address those, Chinese government are actually introducing policies to changing feed-in tariff scheme to a quota system with green certificates, which will be more competitive. That's why you will see that accelerated case line, which is very high, because it all depends on China's policy transition from feed-in tariff to this green certificate system, which is the details are unknown. That's why we kept our forecast conservative on the main case, but we put a larger upside on the accelerated case to take into account all the transition, if the transition is done smoothly. There are also new things going on grid integration. Now you are not allowed to build new wind plants in locations where there are high curtailment. You are not allowed to build new coal plants in the locations where there are grid bottlenecks and high pollution. They are building huge transmission lines to connect the demand centers with the generation. And all these developments are happening, but the pace of these developments is the answer to our accelerated case. If those developments are fast, we will see probably an accelerated deployment. As you can see, for other countries, the accelerated case is relatively small, especially in the United States. We used to have a larger accelerated case in the United States, but all these policy uncertainties led us to keep the accelerated case small. There are a few reasons because of that. The first one is the uncertainty over the existence or implementation of Clean Power Plan, obviously. So we basically take it out from our forecast this year. So it was last year in with the early implementation phase starting from 2020. So this year it's not in. That's the biggest change. But also the policies introduced in terms of trade on the solar PV issue, and also the tax reform, which can actually affect significantly the economics of renewables in the coming months, if passed. So overall, our forecast is 12% more optimistic, mainly on solar PV revisions in India and China because of the step change that I mentioned in 2016, especially in China. So China is moving to a large solar PV market. If we combine solar PV and China, that's the picture. So China's share in total solar PV module manufacturing reached about 50% last year. If you include on top of this Chinese companies' investments outside of China, you get to 62%. If you include on top of this the capacity in Taiwan, you get to 82%. If you include other Asian markets, you get to 87, 88%. So solar PV manufacturing is an Asia story, has been an Asia story over the last 2-3 years. And 2017, probably this share will increase a little bit further. So I'm raising this because this was around, China's influence in solar manufacturing was around for a long time, as you can see in the graph. What has changed last year is the red line, which means that China's share in demand. So China is not anymore a story of supply, but it has become also a story of demand. So just a few years ago, China's demand represented only 10% of global solar PV demand. Now it represents about half, and in 2017, probably it will represent about 60%. So we are talking about a country who has manufacturing almost more than half of the manufacturing capacity and more than half of the demand together. So obviously this has global implications because in the future, whatever China does in solar PV, either on industrial policy or solar PV domestic market, which means that the uncertainties that I mentioned a few minutes ago, which will affect the prices, volumes, demand, supply globally. That's why watching the policy transition in China is extremely important to understand global PV markets. For the first time this year, we looked at off-grid capacity. So these numbers are extremely small compared to whatever I was talking previously. So our forecast is 922 gigawatts for all renewables. Off-grid solar PV, we are talking about only 2 gigawatts. So it's peanuts, basically, in terms of when you compare numbers. However, these 2 gigawatts economic influence to people living there is extremely important. So we basically looked at 3 subcategories of off-grid. So mini-grids, industrial applications such as mining, or like commercial applications such as hospitals and so on and so forth, which are mostly fueled by expensive diesel generation right now. And we looked at what are the possibilities in terms of using solar PV in those applications to reduce the diesel costs, which is right now, by the way, combining diesel and solar PV is a no-brainer in terms of the saving diesel costs, especially not only cost, but also the reliability of diesel supply in these regions are extremely weak. So, however, there is an important segment which we call SHC, which is called solar home systems. These are the solar home systems which are 8 watts. So just to compare, a normal commercial panel is about 120 watts. So we are talking about an 8-watt panel with 8-watt to 100-watt panels, but 100-watt is very rare. So we are talking about 8-watt to almost 50-watt panels, combined with a small battery system, energy-efficient appliances such as LED lamps and USB slots in order to charge your phone. So we expect this segment, it's not the largest segment in terms of capacity. We basically try to estimate how many people will get initial electricity access from these small systems in developing Asia and Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And we estimated that about 70 million people in the next 5 years will get initial access to electricity, which means that their lives will be improved significantly in the coming 5 years. We are not talking about this I like to make a differentiation between IEA's definition of energy access. That's why I'm calling initial electricity access, because when you talk about energy access, IEA defines it at a broader level, which is a little bit more challenging with these numbers, because you have to increase in energy ladder. That's why I'm saying initial electricity access. So a first step to not burning your kerosene lamp and having basically an energy efficient lamp to apply for it. And this is driven by both the government initiatives, but also business innovation. Most of these small systems are IT companies, actually, not solar PV companies, through cell phone payment methods, which is extremely important innovation going forward. So we talked a lot about capacity. I think it's important to talk about generation a little bit. So these are our colleagues' forecasts for coal, natural gas, and nuclear in the coming 5 years. Coal obviously remains the largest source of electricity by 2022, despite the renewables growth. But the important point here is this green line. So as you can see, the difference between coal and renewable generation in 2016 was about 35%. In just 5 years, this will reduce to 17 in 2022. So this is an important development. The gap is closing very fast because coal growth slows down, gas growth is stable or slows down, but the renewables are actually will grow very fast in terms of generation as well. This number obviously includes hydropower. So overall, renewables increase their share in electricity 1% each year, from 25% in 2016 to 30% in 2022, which is an important jump when you look at the other sectors, which I will come in a minute. One important point when we talk about generation. Most of this generation will come from wind and solar, variable technologies. They are not base load. Their generation fluctuates based on the weather conditions. So we basically calculated the share of wind and solar in different countries. This is in 2016, and this is what's going to happen in 2022. So as you can see, one country reaches almost 70% of its generation from just wind and solar in 2022, Denmark. This is possible because Denmark has a lot of interconnections with other countries, so it can actually sell this power cross-border. But a more interesting figure is the second one here, Ireland, which is a closed country in terms of its interconnection, and it reaches to 32%. And other European countries follow in terms of the share of renewables. However, the most importantly, the developing or emerging countries such as China, India, Brazil, in just 5 years, they are reaching 10%, from around 5% to 10%, which is extremely an important jump. Obviously, this requires policy attention. This requires policymakers to talk about more and more, or to implement policies to promote more flexible generation, improve their grids or interconnections, look at the demand side management, and increase their flexible generation. For the first time this year, we looked at electric cars. Everyone talks about electric cars. It's a very sexy topic, and it grows exponentially. However, I would like to make an important point that their electricity consumption only represents about 5% of the global electricity consumption of electric vehicles. So when we talk about electric vehicles, we are including 2 3-wheelers and tuk-tuks in this picture, which has the highest share of electric vehicles in the world right now, and mostly in China. As you can see, in major Chinese capitals, you are not allowed to use a gasoline motorbike anymore. You have to use an electric one. It's a regulation for air pollution reasons. So that's why you have this picture, which is driven mostly by China and other developing Asian countries. Over the forecast period, electricity generation from electric vehicles doubles in just 5 years. This is an exponential growth. But one important point here, we actually looked at how much of this electricity will come from renewable energy, because electric vehicles themselves are not renewable. everyone talk about them as they are renewables. Obviously, they have very important contribution to like deal with air pollution because this is another driver, which I mentioned in the challenges. However, it's important that they are charged by renewable electricity, not coal, in order to be able to, so that they are clean. So by 2022, we estimated that only 30% of the electricity coming from renewable will come from electric vehicles will come from renewables. Still, the majority will come from fossil fuels. Majority of the rest will come from fossil fuels and nuclear. So we are talking about electric vehicles, but we shouldn't forget about biofuels because they are really still the significant part of the renewable energy consumption in road transport. So as you can see, electric vehicles only represent 4% of all renewable energy in road transport. With the jump that I mentioned, they will only reach 7% in the coming 5 years. The rest will still be biofuels, and biofuels growth is still strong, driven by Brazil and developing Asia for energy security reasons. Obviously, decarbonizing transport remains very difficult. It only increases from 4% renewable share in transport, road transport. I'm just talking about road right now. I'm not including aviation or shipping. That's a separate business. It only increases for 4% to 5% despite this growth. So decarbonizing transport remains very, very challenging. One last slide on heat. It is usually neglected by policymakers, by the renewable community, because electricity is a good success, but actually heat is very, very important in terms of its share in global final energy consumption. And policies really matter in heat. And we have an example of this. European Union is the leader in the share of renewable heat, and this is because of strong policies that are introduced in 2020 target in terms of the building codes or several other policies. Our forecast shows that US slowly increases its share in heat, both on solar thermal and bioenergy use. In India, actually, the share of renewables in heat declines because renewable growth cannot keep up with the demand growth in the industry, basically. And in China, in absolute terms, it will represent the largest growth in renewable heat, but with a very low base. So that's why the growth will be relatively small. And overall, with our forecast, share of renewables in heat consumption, including electricity use in heat, will increase only from 9% to 11% in 22, a small growth still. Some concluding remarks. We expect about 1 terawatt or 1,000 gigawatt of new renewable capacity to come online in the coming 5 years. Just to give you an idea, what does this mean? It means that half of global installed coal capacity, which took about 80 years to be built. So renewables will build that capacity in just 5 years. In terms of generation, we are talking about 8,000 terawatt hours. It means it equals to the all electricity consumption of China, India, Germany combined, which is a very large generation. Solar PV is basically enters into a new era, as I mentioned. It will be the largest growth of capacity, but also it drives by expansion in China and manufacturing capacity in China, which we have to watch. Despite rapid growth of electric vehicles, decarbonization of transport is a long way off because of other sectors in the transport, such as aviation and shipping, which renewables are used very little. And we need to turn our attention, or policymakers need to turn attention to system integration because of the growth of variable generation in the coming 5 years, and also expanding the use of heat, renewables in heat and heating and cooling. Thank you very much.
Amy, that was tremendous. Thank you so much for such an informative report. My first question is, where do people find the report?
It's on our website.
Great. Which is what, IEA.org?
IEA.org. If you go to the bookstore, it's still there. And Colombia is part of OECD, so anyone can get it for free, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you. Some questions to start the conversation, some follow-up on some points that you raised, and then I know we've got a lot of expertise in the audience here, so I want to bring them in too. So first, I think one statistic I didn't hear in your presentation was the percentage of generation globally that's wind and solar last year. What? Do you know that?
Last year, I think the solar was about 1% and wind was about 4 or 5%. The rest is hydro.
Good.
I think so, yeah. It's still very small
Uh-huh.
in terms of the in 2016 generation, but I can check these numbers and let you know. So.
But yeah, the capacity numbers you cited were very striking. Absolutely.
Exactly, and it will be in terms of the growth in generation in the coming years.
Yes.
It will be they will lead the growth. But obviously, the gap is very large right now.
Your statistic on Chinese manufacturing was, I think, about 50%. It's actually lower than I've seen before. I was surprised. Where else is manufacturing happening other than China right now?
So the manufacturing is happening mainly in Asia. So China and Taiwan as the two major countries. But also over the last 5 years, Chinese companies and also American companies are actually invested in manufacturing capacity outside of China, in Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, majorly these 4 countries. So there's manufacturing capacity is moving, expanding towards these. And there are also very small capacity left in Europe, very small in the United States, some capacity in Latin America, in Mexico. But overall, that's it. The majority still remains here in Asia.
And I guess that raises one looming policy issue, which is the risk of tariffs on solar panels. Here in the United States, as people here may know, a U.S. administrative tribunal has found that Chinese solar panels have injured the U.S. industry. There will be a recommendation to President Trump concerning the remedy for that next month. And then I think President Trump has until January to decide whether to impose tariffs on imports of solar panels. Do you look at the potential risk associated with tariffs in your report, and any comments on that?
Sure. So here the calculation is very simple. I mean, the politics aside, the calculation is very simple. U.S. has about 1.2 gigawatts of production capacity of solar PV. U.S. demand last year was 14.7 gigawatts. This year it will be probably 12 to 13 gigawatts. So which means that there is this huge gap between supply and demand in the U.S. So, as I said, if there's a import tariff on panels, in the short term, there is no question that there will be price implications in the United States. Solar PV modules will become more expensive. Already in the United States, solar PV systems are on average more expensive than in many parts of the world, still for both utility and residential because of the incentive scheme that exists in the United States. There are a lot of costs, financing costs or other lawyers and all these balance of system costs, which are relatively high compared to Europe, in many countries in Europe. So already it's expensive. And it will be more expensive. There is no doubt about that. I mean, calculation is very simple. So the important thing is what the policy wants to achieve. And if the policy wants to achieve an increase in the U.S. manufacturing capacity, maybe it will achieve that. But in the short term, definitely there will be a price impact, which will affect probably many projects that actually have already power purchase agreement contracts and they are going to buy their panels. All these economics will be affected. So it's a downside risk in our forecast. It's not in our forecast. We did not include that. But if the president decides that final decision we will analyze it next year and probably revise our forecast accordingly.
And so the impact would just depend upon the size of the tariff and the way it's structured?
Exactly. The way that they talk about, it's pretty high, actually, the tariff. So this is the draft. So the question here I have is, will it actually attract the new manufacturing capacity? We do not know. I mean, This solar PV trade measures, let's remind ourselves, that have been around for a very long time. This is not the first time that a country imposes tariffs to China because of the anti-dumping. So, I mean, it's happened in 2011, 12. There has been a lot of trade cases between India, China, Europe, China. I mean, it's been around for a very long time. What happened? Simply the manufacturing capacity expanded in China and outside of China to go around the tariffs. I think global trade system will make it. And one important point, that some US companies have manufacturing capacity in Malaysia themselves. So if it's put on China and other developing countries in Asia, which they are talking about, because it's not only China, the major capacity imports are coming from other countries. So the US company will be affected as well, obviously, in this case, or other companies.
Yeah, and actually the U.S. is not the only country looking at tariffs right now. India's got a proceeding underway, which has got a roughly similar timeline, I think.
Yeah.
So, same projection in the Indian market. It just depends upon the size of the tariff in terms of what the impact would be.
It will depend on the tariff. India's situation is a little bit more different because actually all these auctions, the developers are bid very low prices, thinking that in the coming 2-3 years, the module prices will continue to decline. But they didn't think about one important issue. Chinese demand is going up. So if a country controls 60% of the demand and 60% of the supply, it will absorb locally this year probably most of the capacity that is manufactured. So the prices actually may not decrease as fast as you think, which means that all these contracts signed in India may actually be not be delivered at that price. So we will look at that next year, but there's obviously this risk of a dominance of a player on both supply and demand side.
That raises an interesting point you made briefly about the difference between bidding in auctions and then actually commissioning in auctions. And I guess your point was sometimes there could be a low bid, but if it's so low, then perhaps the developer won't be able to actually commission the project. And do you already, you said you're collecting data on this. Does IEA already have results on this? Can you say, for example, what percentage of solar auctions that have been bid have not been delivered at the price?
We don't have the percentage, unfortunately, not yet.
Okay.
I mean, we just started this database this year, but we have few examples. For instance, in the UK, they bid very low. 2 years ago, it's already cancelled. Some of the contracts that are bid in the solar contracts that are bid in Brazil, they are in financial trouble to deliver them, so they want their contract cancellations. So it is. There are few examples, but we will watch. I think most of the wind capacity came online in Brazil, except those that are cancelled because of the economic crisis. That's separate.
Right. I need to politely ask you a question that's in the news among energy wonks, at least, which is there's a lot of dialogue underway about how the IEA projections on renewables have regularly been wrong over the past 10 years. That IEA has regularly underestimated the percentage of renewable growth. And by the way, the criticism is not just of IEA, but EIA, which is the U.S. organization, and major oil companies. And it seems that if you go back, and there's some interesting media on this if anybody's interested, and if you go back and look at projections of renewable growth over the past 10 or 15 years, it's remarkable how almost all the projections have been understated. So any thoughts on that? Do you feel like IEA has adjusted its methodology so you now have confidence in your methodology, or what are your thoughts on this?
So this question is coming up everywhere. Obviously it's important, but I actually would like to clarify one thing for everyone, and the role of IEA in this. So we are doing 5-year forecast and long-term scenarios, World Energy Outlook, that all of you know. So these scenarios, let me start with we have to separate those two. So long-term scenarios are looking at a world in 2040, which is called new policy scenario, which means what are the existing policies today and what they will achieve in the coming 25, 30 years. Okay? So it doesn't look at what can policies be. It looks at government targets, government policies. And this is an important role of the IEA to actually look at government policies and understand what these policies will do to renewable growth. IEA scenarios do not say that this growth will happen. It's a scenario analysis. It's a long-term one. It says if you keep those policies in place, you will get there. So just an important example, how policies affect this growth. Just last year. In 2015, China's wind capacity growth was about 32 gigawatts. In 2016, last year, no one talks about it, it declined to 20 gigawatts. PV skyrocketed, wind declined. Why? Because of a very particular policy reason. People rushed to deploy their projects to get the higher feed-in tariffs declined, the capacity declined. Simple. Okay? So you are talking about a 50% decline or 40% decline in just 1 year. So last year, our report predicted that. I'm not saying we were correct all the time, but at least I'd like to show you the impact of the policy and how it can change these capacity numbers in key countries. And our long-term scenarios are actually, there's a saying that we are happy they are wrong, which means that the governments are listening to policy messages that IEA is giving. And every year, IEA's forecasts are revised up or down according to, or scenarios are revised up or down according to policy changes. If China increases their target, IEA changes its scenario analysis assumptions. So it's very simple. On the forecast side, that's why I'm showing the accelerated case. Again, we are looking at the drivers and challenges. And I have to be very clear here. So if we are not looking at challenges and don't talk about the challenges, what is the point of doing the forecast? So we look at both, and that's why we have two forecasts, one in the main case, the other one in the accelerated case. Last year, our solar PV projections for 2016 was on the accelerated case size. We were on spot on the wind projections, for instance. So IEA does not want that the renewable growth is slow. It just wants to highlight there are certain drivers, certain challenges. If those challenges are met, the growth will be that way. By the way, our accelerated case growth is much higher than our competitors, for instance, just to give you an idea. So
would it be fair then to say that you're saying that the main reason that IEA's projections were understated in prior years, before you arrived, of course, so you have no personal responsibility for this. The main reason they were understated then was that governments adopted more favorable policies for renewables than IEA had in its scenarios.
Exactly. A very simple example. China, 5 years ago, had a solar PV target of 35 gigawatts. Now its solar PV now it has 120 gigawatts installed. So, I mean, the market dynamics change very fast in renewables, and we are publishing annually. So we have to basically wait for the whole year to publish something. We can't publish every week. It would have been easier, actually, if we published every week something and revise little forecasts. So we will never be wrong, probably.
Great. Yeah. All right, one or two more questions, then I want to bring in the audience. Thank you for raising renewable heat, which, as you said, almost never gets discussed. Would you just talk about renewable heat, what it is, what the technologies are, how important it is from a greenhouse gas standpoint in particular?
Sure. So, so there are a few technologies in renewable heat. One is bioenergy, use of the bioenergy for heating, basically stoves with wood pellets. We are talking about modern renewable energy, not traditional biomass that is used in Africa. So we don't count this as renewable. So there's a bioenergy, which is the largest source of heat right now in the world, followed by solar thermal, water heaters, which you have a lot in the US for pool heating and so on and so forth. You have geothermal heating, which is basically using geothermal for heating purposes, not only for electricity. You have solar thermal, bioenergy, geothermal, and you have also heat pumps, obviously, which are used for heating and cooling. We calculate what is the renewable electricity account for in the heat pump consumption in order to estimate the renewable share because they are using electricity. So there is that part. So the bioenergy is the largest. Second one is solar thermal. But in terms of growth, the renewable electricity share of this heat pumps consumption is increasing, and solar thermal growth is declining. Interestingly, because of China again, because China had an incredible growth of solar thermal because of its building industry. That basically skyrocketed over the last 10, 15 years. However, the life standards of people are changing, which means that if you are becoming richer and richer in China, you switch to an electric boiler because your life standards are increasing. You want to use a more consistent temperature of water. So some people are switching to those. The major challenge of heat is that it's really fragmented. It's not like electricity output. You have industry that are using heat. You have buildings. You have like from one customer to a large paper and pulp industry who can use heat. And if you have a lot of buildings, which is like the residential customers involved in this, so the choice of residential customers are very different. If my gas boiler breaks up or diesel oil boiler breaks up, I need immediate decision. So I just go and get a new one. I don't even think about, let me calculate how much is the bioenergy boiler. I need urgently a solution, and the supply chain for my gas boiler is basically simple to solve. So I'll just call and get a new gas boiler. So there's also these kind of behavioral issues that is difficult to manage. That's why policies remain key in this sector.
And just by solar thermal, you're referring to hot water heaters,
Exactly.
and really not big utility scale concentrated solar plants.
Oh, those are electric. We count them on
Those are
electricity. Yeah,
but
electricity.
yeah.
Yeah,
That term gets used for both. But
Yeah,
so you're
exactly.
talking about hot water heaters.
Hot water heaters, yeah, for heating purposes.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? I see one in back. Why don't you speak in the microphone and please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Risalat. I'm doing an environmental science and policy program at Columbia. Thanks for that great presentation. I just wanted to ask about the decreasing costs in battery technology and how you think that would intersect with the renewable deployment and capacity
Sure.
growth.
So in our forecast, batteries in the next 5 years, they do not play a significant role. Why? Because they are still very expensive. Although there's a significant decline in cost, but they remain high. I mean, obviously there's a big talk about Tesla batteries, the residential batteries, but let's face it, they are expensive. They are not cheap in terms of how when you combine solar PV and batteries. They have a role to play in some countries if the market design allows large-scale batteries and what can provide to stabilize the grid. In UK, for instance, in one of the capacity markets, some battery project won to basically deliver availability for frequency regulation. In Australia, they are building in some of the places where the grid is basically weak, and then there are grid integration issues. They are building a large-scale battery. But overall, if you talk about storage technologies, there is no doubt that there's one storage technology which is cheap and available, is pumped hydropower. And it actually represents today more than 95% of all storage technologies globally. So, and it's going to expand in some countries. But in the next 5 years, of course, the battery cost will decline significantly as everyone expects. But in order to come to a point where it will be a massive scale at the grid level, we will see how that will go.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, good morning. Stefan Bronner with Capspire. We're a consulting firm in the energy sector. I was going to ask, do you see, you mentioned that a lot of renewable production goes to waste because it can't be taken to the demand centers. Do you see globally policy changes that would allow cross-border trading, and are these progressing at a small pace or a fast pace? So do you see within the next 5 years more regions evolving into systems like we have in Europe, where cross-border trading is common and regulated, or like do you see those trends, and how fast are they progressing?
Sure.
Thank you.
So just one point on the curtailment. So the cost. This is the example that I gave is in China, and it's one of the largest curtailment levels in the world. because of Chinese resources. Wind resources are in the north and northeast part, and all the demand is on the east, on the west. On the east in the industrial area. So north, northwest, and east side. So you need a lot of transmission capacity to basically deploy that. So the number that I gave is related to that, but China is basically trying to solve that problem. At the global level, this integration issue, I don't know if I mentioned in my talk, it's not a technical issue. It's an economic issue. Integrate larger shares of renewables is about how much it will cost. You can basically take large-scale batteries, whatever the price is, deploy them, and you will have a solution. But it will be expensive, obviously. So there are few ways of dealing with grid integration, and the cheapest. There are many ways, but this requires as you said, a policy change. So feed-in tariffs, like generate renewable power, whatever you want, however you want, was renewable policy is 1-0. Auctions to reduce the price and spur the competition is the renewable policy is 2-0. And I think 3-0 is combining those incentives with certain kind of policies that will actually address grid integration issues. It is already happening in some countries, which means that when you auction something, you don't just auction a capacity of renewables, you auction where it is located and when it will generate. So these are the new policies that the government looks at. And in terms of to deal with grid integration, there are 3 or 4 main ways. It's just increasing your flexible generation or using it more efficiently, building more grid between the countries, there are many projects in Africa and many projects in developing Asia in connection with hydropower plants. Large hydropower plants, how we can basically connect these countries in order to provide these. However, there are many challenges to expand the grid, especially in those regions, social acceptance issues, it costs a lot, affordable financing is not available, so on and so forth. But there are a lot of big projects to do that in China as well. Another cheaper way of dealing with grid integration is demand-side response, which is totally unused in many parts of the world, which means that we always talk about supply, we never talk about demand, how people can basically change their behavior or industries in order to balance the grid. This is coming slowly, and this is changing. I think it will change very fast, that we will see us as residential customers or industrial customers are involving more and more, knowing more and more what is the price at that hour. Should I shift my washing my dishes tonight instead of, we are already doing some price mechanisms, but these will become more and more prominent to be aggregated way, obviously, by the utilities to deal with grid integration.
And by the way, for anyone interested in this topic, this is the topic of our next event here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. We're hosting Chairman Liu Zhenya of China State Grid, who's been the principal global proponent for building big interconnections. So it's October 30th here at Columbia campus. Yes.
Hi, Fernando Naya. I'm an independent consultant. Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. My question is divided in 3 parts, I'll say. First part you already sort of responded, and it was about the policies on feed-in tariffs and auctions. I've been reviewing that auctions is not a mechanism for all countries. It seems that for those countries trying to avoid investing or spending money on feed-in tariffs, they called some auctions and they didn't get enough participants, therefore their result wasn't what they expected. So I wonder what other mechanisms are out there. You mentioned something like on green certificates, so if you can elaborate more on that. And second question is in the levelized cost of energy and how the learning curve is affecting this levelized cost. And I wonder across regions who is doing better or reducing cost faster. And last question is on business models. I wonder what is the impact on the innovations on business models among technologies. So I was also reviewing some things on the virtual power plants. It seems to be a good mechanism for competing with traditional technologies. So somewhere. Thank you so much.
A lot there.
So 3 questions, quick answers. Auctions. So it depends what you auction. So auction, we are calling auctions, but some countries auction capacity, some countries auction firm capacity, some countries auction generation, some countries auction within generation within time intervals, some countries auction generation and compete with fossil fuel. So it depends on what you basically auction it. But one important thing that I would like to say here, for a government to set a price for something that you do not have perfect information, which is feed-in tariff, it's quite difficult. So you set a price, you set a price for a certain period of time, which is very long, 15 years or 20 years, but you do not know how the cost will decline, what you will do, right? This was necessary at the time to create the demand. Otherwise, we wouldn't have these cost reductions that we are showing. I mean, let's face it, it's the reality that Europe basically took the leadership on this to reduce the cost because you needed to create a demand. Now it's changing for the competition. But the governments are actually very familiar in auctioning stuff. So all these bridges, all the large infrastructure stuff, it's been around for a very long time. It is important to understand how much of this can be adapted to renewables, of this experience, which I think we see slowly that governments are actually know this, how to do procurement. And it's also important what you auction. For instance, in Mexico, they auction long-term green certificates because the difference between the renewable technologies and fossil fuels is that one has high investment costs in the upfront renewables. The other one has high maintenance costs or operation costs because it needs fuel. The one has zero marginal cost, wind and solar. The other one has marginal cost to run. So there are 2 different technologies. So any auction design needs to take into account these differences. If you do not give a long-term contract to renewables, they will never be able to be built because no one can take this. It's very difficult to take the risk of this investment in the first place or the upfront without knowing what you will generate. So that's why I think the auction or market designs should address 2 issues. One, how we can attract the investment to basically meet the demand. And if you want to attract renewable investment, you need to have some way of introducing a long-term auction system. But at the same time, you need to have a short-term market that will run over time. So another thing is the learning curves. So we are looking at learning curves in our forecast, how the system cost will decline. We separate, for instance, for solar PV modules versus balance of system costs, which are more sticky in terms of the cost reductions. But over the short term, to be very frank with you, these learning curves is very difficult to deal. I mean, we are using them, but over the short term, like 5-year periods, they are difficult to understand. In a longer term, obviously, when you look at since 1970s, you will see that curve. But implementing them over the 5 years, we find them challenging. Up to 2040, there is no other way of doing it. Obviously, you need to use an assumption. But renewable technologies, and coming back to the innovation connecting this, some renewable technologies have been overperforming in terms of the learning curves that people were expecting. And this, I would like to give the example of offshore wind, actually. So people were expecting in Europe, it's mostly deployed in Europe, were expecting some kind of cost reduction trend. The government set targets. Right now, all of them, the industry beat all these targets by far in Europe. So now, I didn't put that slide because of the time limitations, but in Europe last year, there were several offshore wind auctions which were almost at the wholesale price levels. Not today's wholesale price levels, but they didn't accept subsidies. So they said that we are building this in 2023, 2024, but we do not want any subsidies, just the market price. So this is an incredible innovation. And another technology is coming up is CSP, which has a storage as well, concentrated solar power, which is actually moving to places like it used to be in Spain and US. Now it will be in Middle East and Africa because of the radiation levels. And we will see more and more CSP plants because it's also good for integration. because it has now up to 15 to 16 hours of storage. So in some technology, so it's still relatively expensive, but it's coming down very fast.
So that's a little bit different than other projections I've seen that's interesting on CSP. So the kind of mainstream forecasts I've seen before have been that PVs are out competing CSP and much cheaper, but you're bullish on the potential for concentrated solar power?
Our forecast is not very optimistic, but on the innovation side, last 2 years we saw that it was like very slowly moving in terms of the new projects and so on and so forth. But last year we saw that there were many auctions because some countries need PV, some countries need certain kind of technology which has storage. And now people are combining both. So they are combining solar PV with concentrated solar thermal to have the around-the-clock generation, basically, which is an important development.
Good afternoon. My name is Cameron. I'm an undergraduate econ major here. And my question to you is, in the last 8 years or 10 years, the United States government declassified waste energy as a renewable energy through the American Recovery Act. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on that in regards to the fact that if you include in a waste energy plant that they're not landfilling, that provides negative GHG emissions compared to solar and wind, which do have a slight bit of GHG emissions. Obviously not as much as coal and other fossil fuels, but that's my question.
So we are dividing, our statistics divides the waste to energy into two, renewable waste and non-renewable waste. So our bioenergy forecast includes renewable waste. So we do not include non-renewable waste. We don't account for them as renewable. I think it's an important trend in many developing countries, actually, to produce energy from waste, especially in increasing urbanization. One of the major drivers of our forecast in China on bioenergy and in other developing countries is increasing urbanization and which actually do not need incentives that much, these plants, because the supply is there. And then I agree with you that it's very important, but we have to differentiate between renewable waste versus the non-renewable waste, which we do in our statistics. To promote that, I agree with you. It's important to.
What is non-renewable waste?
Well, the non-renewable waste I don't have on top of my head, but for instance, any feedstocks that are taking out from the industrial processes. Okay. As a renewable waste. But non-renewable waste is those that are chemicals that are taken out from the industry that are not used are used for generation. It's not renewable, obviously.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, a question here.
Okay.
Hi. There. Sorry.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Mo, and I'm a MPA student from CEPA with the Energy and Environment concentration. And first, thanks for your informative presentation. And my question is, what's your perspective in terms of the nuclear energy? Because it's a very controversial issue right now, especially after the Fukushima crisis. But as I know, Chinese government won't just stop to move forward in this area, and they are trying to do more investment abroad as they do in the domestic market. So what's your opinion about this topic? Thank you.
So nuclear energy has a role to play definitely in decarbonization, especially if we want to move towards this 2 degrees target that we have. So it has a role to play. So in order to reach that target, we will need a portfolio of technologies going forward. And nuclear as a zero carbon emitter technology, of course, it has a place. But where it is acceptable, that's another question mark. So this is up to governments to basically decide whether to take, whether to deploy renewables or not. And there are 2 opinions on this. Some governments do not want to get into nuclear generation, or they are retiring their nuclear generation very fast, such as those in Europe, in Germany, and in other places. But those that are basically see nuclear as a solution. This is a government choice to basically choose which portfolio of energy You want to move forward. And obviously, there's a challenge to deploy nuclear despite, I mean, I'm not talking about the risk. These are up to government officials to evaluate that. But it's also the upfront investment of nuclear remains really high. So you actually need to have a system or kind of an incentive for any company to take that initial risk. So that's a big challenge that the governments need to address. In Europe, there are several new plants. They are delayed by 8 to 9 years. Their costs almost doubled or tripled. So with the new technology, so it depends on how you want to approach it. UK government decided to support Hinkley Point as a new generation and provided a long-term contract. It will be a government choice to decide how to decarbonize.
Yes. Then, yeah, first here and then.
Hi, I'm Ripunjay. I'm a first-year student of MPA program in SEPA with a concentration in energy and environment. Thanks for the presentation. Actually, I just wanted to ask that, so India is going towards electric vehicles in a big way, and they have a very ambitious target of 100% electric fleet by 2030. As you've rightly mentioned that, you know, most of the electricity which is required to fuel that electric vehicle would not come from renewables. How do you think that, what would be the impact of a high electric vehicle fleet on the electricity grid, given that the gap between demand and supply in India and probably in other countries is increasing because the demand is going down and is stabilizing, and people are putting more and more of generation
Sure.
stations.
So
thank you.
in the coming 5 years, our electricity consumption of electric cars will represent in 2020 just 1% of global electricity consumption. This may sound extremely small, just 1%. In terms of actually, it's very large. I mean, our forecast shows that it's 1% is actually a large number. So, but your question refers to when cars are charged. This is the not only that the consumption is increasing, but when people charge their car and what is the impact of that specific hour, the peak demand. That's the whole discussion. And right now, we couldn't find a reliable data on the behavior of people, how they charge their car. This will basically define how policies should address in terms of the tariff mechanisms for those cars. When they are charged, they should actually contribute to the system value, which means that those batteries can be used as batteries, all these cars, at certain times. But it requires how the tariff structure is designed, and if the tariff structure is designed in a way that supports to shave the peak or contribute to the generation with storage options, this will require exactly the 3-0 renewable policies that I just mentioned. So an integrated renewable policy looks at the whole system, including electric cars, which has a storage. But we do not know if people are charging their cars at night, mostly, or during their work hours, or on the street and public chargers during the day. We couldn't find the reliable data, but we would like to. That will be an interesting charging behavior. Interesting data, yeah.
And your 1% figure is that electric vehicles could take up 1% of global electricity demand?
Generation.
In what time frame?
In 2022. In 2022. Okay. So it's 1% of global electricity generation, which is, yeah.
It's actually, yeah, as you said, it's a big number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Merav Cohen. I am just a recent graduate from SEPA, Masters in Environmental Science and Policy. Thank you for your presentation. My question, I want to take you to a little bit of a more wholesome approach. Oftentimes in the talk about energy, we look at the bottom line of watts, right? And my question to you is, in your research, have you looked at all, and do policies refer at all to the life cycle of the energy, of the renewables? And if, you know, do they take into consideration the processing, manufacturing, the emissions taken into both the manufacturing and the disposal, et cetera? Thank you.
Sure. So this question came yesterday's presentation as well. This is a new trend that everyone is asking the life cycle because the renewables are growing very fast, and then people are wondering what's going to happen afterwards.
Important question.
Exactly, very important question.
Yeah.
So in the next 5 years, we are going to build 1,000 solar PV panels a minute in our forecast. So every minute there will be 1,000 solar PV panels will be built, which means that it's a quite large number. So we don't do life cycle assessment. So at TI, at least my division, we don't do it. But there are research that I know that the payback period of these life cycle assessment is 3 years, 4 years for PV, so on and so forth. So, but what we see is that there are policies emerging for the decommissioning of these plants and recycling of these plants, especially for certain technologies such as wind. Solar PV, I'm not really aware, but I'm sure there are. But the governments, because you asked the policy question, are putting in place, if I auction this capacity to you, you have to make sure to put some money aside when you sign the contract to decommission your plant. So this is happening in offshore. So you are required in the Netherlands, in Denmark, to put a fund aside to keep it for 30 years, not touch it during the whole operation of the plant, to be able to decommission that plant after you are done with it. So there are a few policies, but still I think this is an area which requires for instance, solar PV panels include all this silicon, what's going to happen to those, the precious metals that are included in there in the wind turbines. Wind turbines is relatively easier because you have a whole steel which can be recycled in the tower. You have in nacelle certain rare earth materials. How do you call it? Precious materials, rare earth materials. So exactly, metals. So there are ways of doing it, but it's a very important topic. I think that the policy is starting to address, which will actually come to a point, especially for solar PV panels, the recycling gear.
It's not only a matter of whether or not you recycle it, but it's also taking into account
how much you
and the energy that you're putting into both manufacturing it and recycling it. So you have to offset it.
Exactly, but I think overall, in terms of this, solar renewable energy technologies are doing well because during their lifetime they don't emit much. Of course, after and before they do, but during their lifetime at least it's zero almost. Yeah, that helps for the overall life cycle.
It's a great question to end up on, and we need to wrap up. And but Hemi is able to stick around and answer some questions for those who want to come talk privately. But I think this could be a great topic for the IEA to look at. I think because I'm hearing a lot of questions on this too, and some just even looking at what are the different analyses out there on the life cycle emissions associated with these technologies would be very interesting. Maybe for next year's report. We hope we hope to welcome you back then. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for such an informative report. Please join me in giving Hemi a big hand.
Thank you very much.